Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and Happy New Year. We are just getting started and welcome today to our next session of the 2021-2022 Learning Exchange Series. I am your host today, Lauren Cooper, and I am the director for the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University. And we are pleased to lead the Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. If you are unfamiliar, this group is a diverse coalition of forest interests with over 60 members, member organizations, I should say, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. This group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. And as part of our commitment to knowledge sharing, we have this webinar series. Delighted to show the full year's lineup of speakers here. It's a bit small to read on this slide, but we'll go ahead and drop a link to the webpage. And you can check out all the remaining speakers in this year's lineup. And you can also find all recordings for previous sessions. This year, we have three major thematic bins. We have voluntary carbon markets, changing landscapes of climate and forests. And then finally, the last three sessions will cover emerging science. So to get to today's speakers, I am delighted to introduce Abigail Weinberg and Jennifer Melville from the Open Space Institute. They'll be giving a presentation today titled Forest Protection and Carbon Mitigation, Data and Approaches to Maximize Impact. So we're really looking forward to hearing from our speakers. I should also mention that this is the first presentation or the second presentation in the climate and forests and a changing landscape section of our full lineup. Before I hand it over, a couple of housekeeping details. Feel free and you are encouraged to please submit questions at any point during the webinar. And you can use the chat feature or the Q&A. We'll keep an eye on both. But any clarifications that pop up, feel free to add those questions at any point because we do want to capture those from you as we have our speakers rolling. And then we will have a discussion at the end. Sorry, excuse me. So sorry. Oh my God. Okay, sorry about that. I am not in my own home. So again, you're strongly encouraged to please add questions at any point, and we're looking forward to a nice discussion at the end. If you are interested in hearing more about this webinar series and other information from the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program, we'd love to have you join our email list. So please email forestc@msu.edu to join the email list, and you'll get notifications of also all of our future upcoming events. Next slide, please. Also to note, if this is relevant to you and your profession, we do have some continuing education credits available for this event. So attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF, the Society of American Foresters, and these will be automatically communicated to SAF with the email that you use to sign up for this event. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and you could also contact SAF directly if you want to check your account. Thank you. Next slide, please. And so with that, we are going to hand it over to Abby and Jennifer. And so we'll pull up their slides here and look forward to hearing from our speakers today.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Laura and Daphne, who's behind the scenes here, Daphna, who's behind the scenes here. It is so valuable to have this exchange and this place where there's an ongoing dialogue about the role of forests in a low carbon future. So at the Open Space Institute, we've really valued it, and thank you very much for making it possible. I do want to jump right into the presentation. I was going to mention briefly that I have COVID. I'm at the tail end, and I'm fine. I'm slow. So if there's any delays in me, that's my apologies in advance, but I recognize also that many people are not okay as this pandemic continues to sweep across our globe in different forms. So just acknowledging the times that we're in, many and different challenges that we face, and hopefully we can make some progress on some of them together here today. So Jen and I today are going to talk about this kind of big question of what is the right role for forests in meeting climate goals, and propose that in some ways land protection particularly has a role to play. And we'll share how OSI and others are putting some approaches into practice to bring land protection more formally into the fore here, and share the data and resources that we are using to do that. So I realize you may not know who I am too. So I'm Abigail Weinberg. I've been at the Open Space Institute for 16 years, I believe, at this point. And I'm our director of research for conservation. And you'll be learning a little bit more about exactly what we do in this presentation. So if there are other questions, we're happy to. I think you have our bios. So, all right, now you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So who are we? The Open Space Institute works across the Eastern United States, and we're at heart a land trust, which means our mission is to permanently protect land. And often with land trust, it means for multiple values. And you see a lot of those values here. But one of the unique things in the next slide is that in addition to doing direct acquisition in certain parts of the East, we also run grant programs. And this map is showing the location of over 260 grants that we've made in the 20 years since we've been operating. On the left-hand side are the different grant funds that we've operated over those years, and you can see the activity with the number of grants, which isn't always indicative of the size of those grants. But in total, we have protected, supported, and partnered in the protection of nearly 2 million acres. Our goal with the funds is certainly permanent protection, but it's also to advance the use of science and land protection by our partners, which are both land trusts and state agencies across this entire geography. And through our grant program, we've given away $50 million and to protect all this land. And of course, this is really only one small piece of all of the conservation that's getting done. In fact, by 2020, the land trust census indicated 60 million acres, much of it forests, but not all, the equivalent of about 10% of US forests land, if we were to consider the 700 million acres of forest land, is protected by land trusts specifically. So influencing how these groups act, and of course, state agencies as well, and the way that they use science to do that can have a big impact on carbon. So that's why we're here. This is very specifically our interest. The next slide, we notice that land protection has been largely left out of formal and informal carbon accounting. The US Climate Alliance Natural Working Lands brings much needed attention and really action to the natural climate solutions arena. And many states have funds for land protection, like shown here, Pennsylvania, DCNR, Department of Conservation Natural Resources, has a very large program. The Washington State program also shown here. They're all over the country. And yet the carbon accounting for the natural working lands leaves out these protection programs, which is really interesting. And in some ways, we know why. And the next slide indicates traditional land protection offers no formal accounting for the additional carbon sequestered above the assumed baseline, right? And I'm just reminding us all what we mean by additionality here with this helpful image from MSU. And there are certainly opportunities for leakage as well. Meaning the development of forest loss, that might have occurred on a property absent protection could certainly move somewhere else, right? We're not accounting for any of that in the traditional land protection tool. And while we acknowledge the importance of the accounting, we also know very well that land protection often moves land into conservation management, meaning very good quality management, uneven aged forests that are ideal for carbon storage. So there's this kind of interesting, tension between what the tool does and what we can account for, certainly. In the next slide, even more important, securing our existing forests and whatever additional sequestration occurs all happens without the offset of emissions, right? So I'm poking a little bit at markets here very lightly because I certainly see the role for them. But in a land protection project, we're completely in the black or the green, you might say, in terms of taking carbon out of the atmosphere without adding anything back in. This raises an interesting question. What is the role of our forests in a low carbon future? And how do we navigate these different options? We've certainly made some choices and put some emphasis in certain places to date. And are there adjustments needed there? So integrating forests into markets monetizes the carbon value and puts them on par with other carbon strategies. It has developed important methodologies for measuring additionality and leakage, developing remote inventories. This has all been invaluable. So there's no way in which recommending those things be thrown out. And we certainly don't have the answer to exactly how we move forward, but we'd like to pose that the tools developed around land protection are very relevant to this carbon conversation and could be integrated more fully. So in the next slide, some of the pros and cons that we are seeing. So on the pro side, permanent protection, of course, protects that base of carbon we assume will be there. And with 35 years worth of US carbon emissions stored in our forests, that is very relevant. So, we're often operating at a baseline that we assume that forests that are there are going to remain there, minus maybe some assumptions for development or other accounting. But can we really assume that? So, of course, protecting that base seems relevant. Protection often shifts the ownership, as I mentioned briefly earlier, into a conservation-minded management. So while the act of protection is momentary, the impacts really do often shift the land management quite a bit, even though they can't completely control that land management all the time. But there are some ways to even inform it. And this often results in increased sequestration. So could this be better quantified or assured in a land conservation transaction? We do think it can be. As well, this is a very well-established tool. So in terms of landowner familiarity and willingness, there's a ready audience that's comfortable with this tool. It's understood by the landowners. It's an upfront payment. And we think that also offers some value. So there's some landowners that aren't going to go for carbon contracts, certainly are not going to be early adopters, and land protection may be a great opportunity to reach them. As well, it protects many co-benefits along with the carbon. Those other co-benefits are well protected by the easement or fee purchase. It can explicitly protect the carbon value through easement terms, and Jen's going to be talking more about that in detail. And as discussed, there are plenty of things this tool doesn't do, and we're not suggesting it should do those things. But with some of these additions in place, are there some ways to value land protection as part of carbon accounting? And feel free, Laura, I see some questions. If there's anything that needs clarification, just let me know.
Yeah, actually, Abby, on that note, there is one clarification. You're using the term land protection, and we were just hoping to get the definition from the OSI perspective on that.
Yeah, that's such an important issue. Yeah. In my head, I've clarified that I think of land conservation as being very broad. So land conservation as being everything from restoration, to it could be green stormwater. And then protection, what I'm talking about is some kind of deed, easement, or purchase that where the land is managed and owned for conservation value. So long-term. So that could be, generally we're talking about permanent land protection. And I think there's room for conversation about whether that's permanent or some kind of other term. But yeah, we're usually talking about easement and fee purchase.
And then Abby, the other clarification in there, does that include forest management or sustainable harvest in some or all cases?
That varies greatly across the range of easement and fee purchases. So I'm not assuming that's in there. And what Jen will be talking in detail about is how we are integrating those management considerations and the forest carbon specifically into the protections, which can be done through the easement and that kind of thing. So we look at those as two separate elements, but and not necessarily assumed.
Great. That was it for now. Thanks, Abby.
Oh yeah. Keep them coming. Good questions. Thank you for the clarification. So where I wanted to go here is to emphasize that there actually is more and more voice and support for thinking about land protection in these terms. And in the two quotes on the next slide, you're really seeing two prominent people kind of coming out clearly to say that land protection has a really important role to play in the question of carbon. And not in a quantifiable way necessarily, but in some way, this is a good thing to do with your money if you have money and you're interested in carbon. And these are quotes from the New York Times, which actually Andrew Bowman from the Land Trust Alliance, which is the umbrella organization for the land trusts in the US, pulled and shared somewhat recently. And what you see here is them emphasizing the role of land trusts, capturing multiple values, also doing important work for carbon. And this other piece that they're emphasizing of multiple values being captured is something we also, of course, heard loud and clear through the most recent IPCC report and the joint IPCC and I'm going to get this name right, the International Panel on Climate Change and Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I know you can go to the next slide here. That joint panel had a workshop and they put out a summary of that workshop, which really emphasized how important it is that we not address the carbon and the biodiversity crisis in silos. And 2 points that they emphasized very clearly, that climate change and biodiversity crises have similar origins and yet been tackled independently to date. And that to be effective, we need to address these issues in concert and better target and plan for protected areas that meet multiple objectives. So to do that, one thing we were aware that we need is better data. And so I'm going to start to introduce a data set that Open Space Institute has been using. And I'll take a little time with that because my understanding is that hasn't been shared in this venue, and then pass it over to Jen to really talk about how we're integrating that into our work. So the next slide, this work is all part of our Appalachian Landscape Protection Fund, which we launched last year in order to address the twin crises of biodiversity and carbon through land protection. And in doing that, we realized we needed some way to identify where are the high carbon forests that we would want to protect. How much sequestration is expected from those forests under kind of good conditions? How can we ensure that sequestration occurs on the lands that we protect? So these were some of the questions we had coming into this work. And as I mentioned, this data set was really relevant to being able to do that. So in the next slide, I just want to take a little bit of time going through the different elements that we sort of discovered were important in finding a data set that could really help us target carbon on the landscape. So one element is the date that the carbon data comes from. So almost all carbon data sets are coming from forest inventory analysis data, so on the ground data, which of course isn't contiguous, but it has very good coverage across the US. And that system is always a little bit behind because it takes a long time to collect that data. So the most current data that's available is 2015. A lot of data sets were going all the way back to 2000, which at this point is quite old. The next thing is the extent of the data. And in the next little image, you see the, this is global carbon data. It's very, very gross scale, meaning that, any one individual pixel is about 350 acres, which just does not work for the scale of land protection, which often happens at about 350 acres, or certainly less, sometimes more. And so we really needed to have the right resolution of the data. And we were ideally looking for something at a 30-meter resolution, which is very commonly used. And then there was the issue of too high resolution, right? We could go, and we did think about, do we buy data? You can just keep going through these as I speak, but so, there's certainly proprietary data where they're actually going out and they're inventorying the landscape and getting very high resolution data, which is quite expensive. So that also wasn't going to work for us. The third issue being the carbon pools. So up on the upper right, what you're seeing is Woods Hole data, which was put out very early on, but only included above ground biomass. So excluded completely the soil carbon and didn't include coarse woody debris. And then the next tile is showing this data from Clark University that's developed by Chris Williams. And what was amazing when we found this data was that it not only showed storage, carbon storage at the 2010 data, which at that time was the most recent that we could find. It also developed models to project that the sequestration from that storage forward and even backwards. So you can actually get the carbon estimates for any date using this model. Well, I don't know if it goes to any date, because I assume at some point there would be a regeneration they would not have. But that was really relevant to us because we were really targeting 2050 as an important date to achieve carbon goals. And then the last piece that was so wonderful when we found this data was that it was actually already available online. And while we have the capacity to work with these large data sets, as I mentioned earlier, a big part of our goals is a big part of our goal is to be able to share this work with others and have them integrate it into their work. So having it be integrated into an online tool was also very, very relevant. And I also want to acknowledge just a comment that came through that the FIA data is now updated to 2019 in most locations. So that's great to hear. So this data set, which I'll talk more about, next slide. So this data set, again, coming from Clark University, Chris Williams' lab, has been really valuable. And you can see here, this is the 2010 data. And in the dark reds on the left-hand side of the western side of the country, you're seeing our very high carbon stores there in the Pacific Northwest. And then in the blues in the east, some of the higher carbon stores, and then the greens and even the yellows in some of our wood basket states where carbon storage is a bit lower because of that more frequent ongoing harvest. And then if we go slowly between to the next one, what you'll see is watch the blue expand. And this is the 2050 data. So yeah, you can toggle between these for a moment. but you can see the changes that are assumed without any management of the forest. So this model assumes just continuous growth. And that gives us the opportunity to sort of experiment with what would the future look like in 2050 if we allowed our forests to grow. So that gives us at OSI a very helpful baseline for understanding where these forests could be at a future date. We'll say a little bit more about this, in the next slide. And there are some challenges with using this data set as well. So as I mentioned, the data includes both below ground, but also coarse woody debris. So it has, all three main pools of carbon: the actual trees, of course, the below ground wood, the below ground soils, and then the coarse woody debris. So or you could call that 4 pools. Many ways to account for that. And then the other thing, though, is because of the 2010 stamp on the data, it does mean that any harvesting, disease outbreaks, windstorms that came through post 2010 are not recognized by the data. So that's been an important thing to do, is to be able to go back and account for changes in the forest cover, in order to really best understand what the conditions really are today and then would be in the future. So how reliable are the data sets? I just want to briefly share that in the next slide, a couple of informal studies we did with some partners to try to get a sense for how much we could rely on this data. We were still quite hesitant to use this data at the parcel scale as we kind of came into this work, feeling that, we just really didn't know how reliable it was. So we worked with a few TNC colleagues with forest inventory data from carbon sales, and to compare the results of this data with this very detailed carbon inventory. And you'll see in the little pop-up, if you advance, that we looked at clusters of projects in 2 geographies. So the first one being in the Delaware River Basin. It's just an area where we were working and where there were a number of carbon projects that our partner had. And we found that on 12 projects, the forest carbon compared with the Clark University data, there was only a 6% error. And thanks to Kevin Yoder for this work, comparing them. And then in the central apps, also looked at 4 projects and found a very strong correlation among the inventory data and this. So this gave us a huge amount of confidence. And we were really shocked, I think, particularly by some of the comparison with some, at the time, it was Sylvia Terra data, and impressed. So that we certainly is not publishable, but wanted to share our own learning with you. And next slide. So I'm going to pass this off to Jen, and the only thing I want to just share is that in the Northeast, there's actually quite a few other data sets that Chris Williams, in partnership with Laura Marks, who's out of TNC, Massachusetts, put together. Many of you may be very aware of these data, but some of them even looking at the cost of carbon, of protecting the carbon in the forests across the Northeast. And so this is a cost surface, assuming land protection is the means by which the carbon is protected. So the blues being areas that would be less expensive to protect the carbon, and the browns being the more expensive. So this, presents, even some really useful tools for targeting, for prioritizing direct acquisition, evaluating state grants, etc. So I'm going to pass it off to Jen to show how we did that.
Thanks, Abby. We can go on to the next slide there. That would be great, Daphna. Yeah, it's great to be with all of you. As Abby said, I'm Jennifer Melville. I work with the Open Space Institute. I'm the Vice President for Conservation Grants, and I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Wabanaki and the Benaki, which we mostly call coastal Maine. So I'm up north, and so happy to be with all of you. So what I'm going to do is talk about how OSI is really working to meet this goal, or try to meet this goal of encouraging and enabling our conservation partners, land trusts, tribes, public agencies across the Appalachians to give strong consideration to climate protection, including forest carbon, as they put their land conservation efforts together, because it is confusing. It's hard to do this work. So our job is to bring together tools and resources and funding to help all of us meet the climate challenge. Next slide, please. So our goals are, twofold. We're looking at mitigation and adaptation here through our work. We can go to the next one. And next slide. And, as Abby said, we are a land trust, so we're doing work on the ground. Our partners, our colleagues, not Abby and me, but our colleagues are working across the Appalachians to protect land that includes important climate attributes, but we know we can't do it all ourselves. So that's why we have these other programs that are really designed to provide tools and funding to others. So we have an approach that includes these 4 things that I've put up here on the screen. I'm mostly going to talk about our capital grant program, because that is the land protection piece directly. And as an aside, Abby sometimes says land protection, I sometimes say land conservation. I'm not sure we have the same definition, the two of us, but in this case, if I'm saying land conservation, I am talking about permanent conservation of land, and that can include sustainable harvesting or not, depending on the project. So just getting back to that great question somebody had, or a couple people had in the chat. So the tools that we use are capital grants, giving organizations money to go out and buy land and easements, what we call catalyst grants, which are smaller grants to help organizations do planning, because it is difficult to find that kind of small money to go out and do good land protection planning, so that you're finding those carbon-rich forests. We have some technical assistance that we can provide. We have some amazing staff who can provide one-on-one assistance, and then reports, workshops, presentations to spread the word, things like this one. So as I said, I'm mostly going to talk about the capital fund. So let's move to the next slide that talks a little bit about that. The precursor to our current fund, the Appalachian Landscape Protection Fund, which I'm going to talk about mostly, was our old, now it's like 10 years old. We finished this up a couple of years ago. Resilient Landscape Initiative. It seemed groundbreaking. It was groundbreaking at the time. Many of you are probably very familiar with this data that the Nature Conservancy pioneered a decade ago, that helps identify those places that are most likely to support plants and animals as the climate changes. So our first climate fund was really focused on this adaptation piece. The darker the green, just to give you an orientation to this map, if you don't know this data, the darker the green means that these are places that are predicted to be more likely to protect plants and animals. Provide good habitat, to plants and animals. And that's based on connectivity of the landscape, geology and elevation of the landscape, and also microclimates within the landscape. So that was kind of the first, our first climate focused fund. We had funding in 7 focus areas across the Appalachians. Now we've done in our new fund, we can show this in the next slide, the Appalachian Landscape Protection Fund, is where we've taken the terrestrial resilience data, that's still a core piece of our funding, and we brought in that carbon storage and carbon sequestration data, which is on the right-hand side here. And the darker the blue, the higher the carbon is. This is the storage data. So what we're doing now is we have a new fund, which is focusing in those red blobs right now, where there's a strong overlap between resilience and carbon storage and a bunch of other feasibility factors. So we're trying to, and we are supporting projects that are going to meet both of these goals. So let's look at the fund goals next on the next slide. So protecting these climate resilience and biodiverse places, protecting places where we can be assured that there's going to be maintenance and enhancement of forest carbon. So getting back to what Abby was saying about bringing the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis together here. We're hoping that our funding over the next few years will support at least protection of 50,000 acres. And the other piece that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about, but I think it's really important to mention, is we are having a new focus on embedding equity into the way we make our grants and the way we develop our funds, and as well as helping our grantees think about equitable and just outcomes in their work. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but that is another really important goal for us. And of course, increasing awareness, as we're trying to do today, about the importance of land protection and climate. So the next slide, please. So this is just some of the nuts and bolts of the fund. This is going to just scroll down. Thanks so much. This is capital grants. It is a competitive grant program in terms of that people do apply, but we really think of it more as a cooperative grant program because we encourage grantees to call us in advance, to send us their shape files. We'll look at data with them. So even though they are competing against each other, we really want to fund as many projects as possible, and we really want projects to be successful. Right now, we have focus areas that include parts of 9 states. If we raise more money, we'll have more areas that we can fund in. Our goal is to raise about $18 million, which will be leveraged 4-to-1 at least. So that's whatever that is, $90 million. The first round, which we made awards this summer, is actually 14 projects. I counted wrong, and will protect about 20,000 acres. We have an RFP open right now through early February. And for any of you who are interested in applying or want all the nitty gritty, we are having a webinar next Monday. I think it's at 1. And we will go into great detail about the fund. So that's kind of just the big picture. So next slide. So our approach when we're thinking about how we're going to find these high carbon places is first, you've got to think about what's the service area that you're working in. And this is how OSI works in our fund, but this is useful for anybody who's thinking about identifying high carbon forests. So your service area might be a state, might be a land trust service area, it might be your town, might be a province. And then we're looking at using the data that Abby talked about to find those forests that will store the most carbon by 2050, because that's such an important date for us. And then managing that land, or stewarding, caring for that land in a way that's going to maximize forest carbon. This approach is outlined in this document here that we put together with the Land Trust Alliance, American Forest, and the Nature Conservancy. So that is available up on our website. And if somebody has the link, they could put it in the chat. Abby, you might have that. Otherwise, it is pretty widely available. It's short, easy to read, and it identifies this approach. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we actually use this in the fund, that approach, we're looking at our focus areas, and we use the data, the Clark University data that you see again here. The darker blue has more carbon than the green. So it goes from darkest red is the strongest, most carbon. We're looking at each focus area, and we're figuring out what the average is for the 2010 and the 2050 data, so that you're comparing projects against each other within that region. Next slide, please. And then we're looking specifically at projects, the 2010 data and the 2050 data. Because the 2010 data is relatively old, I appreciate hearing that now we can get 2019 data. That's fantastic. I didn't know that. But right now, since we're using the 2010 data, when an applicant comes to us and applies, we want to look and see whether there's been any harvest or loss in the last decade, and then make an adjustment. Then we look at the 2050 data, and just for reference here, the darker the green, the more carbon stored. And we're going to look at management, and we're going to figure out, okay, we're going to adjust whether based on the management that's being proposed here for the project. The way this data works, I think Abby said, maybe not, is there's an assumption of no management, so that the land is just left alone. Clearly, that's not the case for a lot of properties, which is completely fine. So we want to understand how much we might want to adjust. Next slide. So to use the data, instead of actually taking the time to show you how to do that now, I just want to reference this document that Abby put together that's really great. This shows you how to go on the Nature Conservancy tool, because TNC has put all this data right up on their tool, their climate resilience tool. There's a little secret button, it's kind of hard to find, that you click on, and then you can bring your shapefile in and it will do this analysis for you. So the simplest thing to do is to get this document, which is again up on our website, and maybe Abby can put this link in the chat too if she has a moment. Thanks, Abby. It's really handy. So if you want to use the data, this is a very helpful guide. Also, we're more than willing to help anybody who has questions. Next slide, please. So we found the property, we've identified it using the model. So now how do we ensure that as a grantee, or if you're involved in land protection, how do you know that over time this property, the carbon is going to be protected? We're going to look at a suite of factors. Who's the landowner? What are their long-term goals? Who's caring for the land? What are their goals? What's the level of protection given the project structure? So is it outright purchase? Is there a conservation easement? If there's an easement, what's the nature of that easement? Is there going to be a carbon sale? How might that interact with the carbon protection on the property? And again, the easement goals and stewardship plan goals and provisions. Next slide. So what are the kind of strategies that we're looking for? We are looking to see in the stewardship plans and in the conservation easements, and just that there's protection of the high carbon forests as an identification of those forests that are really storing a lot of carbon today and that are likely to store the most. That we're fostering native older forests, mother trees, sometimes called hub trees. There's a plan to avoid carbon release to the extent possible. Protecting those areas that we know do a really great job of storing carbon, like riparian areas, and places that are really more susceptible to loss of soil carbon, steep slopes and high elevation areas. For properties where there's going to be active forest management, and we do support those as well as some forever wild projects, is it a possibility to extend rotations? Can you manage to increase structural complexity? And then this last piece about consulting communities with the land connection, one of the things I think a lot of us are learning is that traditional ecological knowledge, traditional and current indigenous management of land is really very highly compatible with climate protection. So one of the things that we have done over the last few months is consulted with some experts in traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous foresters in particular, who've helped us look at our stewardship guidelines and say, okay, how do we bring forward the traditional ecological knowledge into this carbon protection work? And we're really seeing a strong overlap. We've had some great help from Lucas Tyree at ND Ponics. He's based in Virginia, as well as with some of the consultants at KEDGE, Environmental and Social Impact Consulting. So that's exciting and new for us, something that we are really learning more about. And if people know more about that, have more information, we'd love to learn more. One thing I will mention is that we also have a carbon resources guide on our website under the Appalachian Land Protection Fund, and it does have at least one really great document that was put together by NIAX along with a tribe in the Midwest, or I think several tribes in the Midwest, really focused on bringing traditional ecological knowledge and climate protection, land protection together. One more slide on this topic. If there's a conservation easement, again, we've been looking at this with our indigenous land consultants, our TEK consultant. What are some of the easement considerations that we want to look at? And we want to think about including carbon protection as a purpose. We want to see that the carbon values are stated in the easement and in the baseline, and that there's some clear protection for standards of forest carbon. One important caveat is that, and some of you may know this, if you have a conservation easement and you want to do a carbon sale, you have to really know about how those might interact, because sometimes if you have certain kinds of language in your easement, it could have an impact on a future carbon sale. Luckily, the Land Trust Alliance has done a really great job, and I think Kelly's on the call, Kelly Watkinson from LTA, who has sort of spearheaded that work, have really they have a great document that helps you understand the interaction between conservation easements and carbon sales. So I would reference that for those who are interested in that. Next slide, please. So just a few other, I'm just going to touch briefly on some of our other non-capital grant programs. So we have the Catalyst Grant Program, which makes small grants to tribes and land trusts and other conservation groups to do strategic conservation planning. Those grants are available throughout the East, not just in those focus areas that I showed you. We just did a series of grant awards this fall, 14 grants totaling about $140,000, ranging from $2,300 to $15,000 in 7 states. So they're relatively small grants, but we think they have a pretty high impact. We run this program along with LTA, Land Trust Alliance. And we should have another RFP, I think, going out this spring or summer. And then the last program I'll talk about on the next slide is our technical assistance program, again, a joint program with the Land Trust Alliance, where our staff provides one-on-one technical support on how to use this climate data in conservation planning. And we're working with Land Trust, as you can see here, from Maine to Florida. So that's really exciting work as well. The last thing I just wanted to say, which is, we're really excited to see states, some of the states that we work with and work in, starting to take action. And Abby talked about this early on. And just 3 examples that I know of, and I'd love to hear others if you know of them, where states are doing strong climate action planning and recognizing the importance of land protection for carbon, understanding how important their forests are to reaching their climate goals. Just 3 here, I'll mention Maine, my home state now, just put together an action plan about a year ago, which has a lot of strong language about forest land protection and the importance of that for reaching our 2045 carbon neutrality goals. As Abby said, that hasn't been in the accounting, but it's critical to the future accounting. If we don't protect those forests that make up most of Maine, we will not meet our goals, and we need to do better forest management, and we need to do more land protection. Vermont, Jad's state, I think Jad's on the call, just adopted their initial climate action plan last month, now has to be adopted, pieces of it have to be adopted by the legislature. And again, they have some really interesting and great recommendations around climate protection, forest protection for climate. And lastly, I'll just mention that New Jersey has their scoping document on natural and working lands, and they're taking comment now. The draft scoping document does have a strong recommendation about land protection. And if any of you are from New Jersey and want to make comment, I think the comment period's open for at least a couple more months. So great to have people weigh in on that. So in summary, I would say, and there's just a last slide here, we are excited to hear your questions. Oh, I know we have about 10 minutes left, and suggestions. We're always looking for new approaches of ways of working with you and other partners in forest protection, and we'd love to hear your ideas and suggestions and questions. Back to you, Lauren.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer, Abby, for this really nice overview of all of your work and how you're including carbon and climate. We have some great questions here, so I will jump into a couple of those. One is a clarification for Abby. Let me see if I can go to gallery view here. And Daphne, do you think you could unshare the screen maybe? Because I don't think that we'll maybe need to go back to the specific slides right now. But one question for Abby, where are you seeing adjusting, you covered a lot of data sources and different models and source of information. Do you know if these are adjusting for a changing climate going forward and how those may affect carbon storage?
Right. If the temperature warms, and do the tree models account for the growth models, for example, account for faster growth? I think they're all based on FIA data. So I don't know that they explicitly adjust beyond the growth that's been tracked. Now, there may be impacts of climate that are starting to show up in the actual growth that's happening on the ground, and then that will get integrated into this model specifically. That's my best guess. And Laura, it's great. I was glad to see you were weighing in the chat. If you have anything you want to add there. But yeah, I'm sure the modelers would have a lot more to say about, where they're going with that. But that's my understanding to date related to Chris's work.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I know that is a big challenge for those in the carbon modeling space is how to grapple and address changing climate. So thanks for that. I was just wondering if you had any insight. And then Jennifer, could you share a little bit more insight on maybe the types of organizations that have applied for and received funding particularly in the Appalachian region there, your most recent projects? You kind of rattled off a couple of organization types, but are you also looking at like maybe municipalities or land trusts, tribal organizations?
For the capital grants in the first round, we had all of the funding, all of the applicants, I believe, except maybe one were land trusts. So typically our grants have gone to land trusts. And one of the things we've been trying to do though is broaden that aperture. We are happy to fund municipalities. We now have the ability to fund state and federal recognized tribes. We have some funding for tribes that are through our Catalyst grant program, but we haven't had any tribes apply yet for capital funding. So we have, that's basically where the funding is going. And most of our land trust funding goes to smaller or regional land trusts. That's the emphasis.
That's great, thank you. Another question we had here is, have you identified barriers to your work or to this work that could be remedied with federal policy changes? And this is kind of particularly aligned with the Forest Climate Working Group, which, as Jad dropped a note in there about the policy platform, but kind of thinking of, what have you, I don't know if you've done any thinking about this, but are there barriers that could be discussed at a federal level and to support your work? What might those be?
Neither of us are policy experts. I would say though, that it would be amazing, and I know we've talked about this a little bit, to see, the federal funding focus on climate and federal funding focus on carbon. So, if there was an alignment between some of the work that we're talking about and those federal funding sources, that would be really helpful, because we do have projects that get matched by federal dollars, especially Forest Legacy Program dollars. So if there was an alignment there from a policy perspective, that could be incredibly helpful and effective, and a great signal to the land conservation community and also to the states that receive that funding that this is the priority. So that, Jad and others may want to weigh in, or Abby, but that would be just one key thing for me.
Well, the thing I wanted to add was maybe two bits. One is that I think in some ways, I would say my hope in coming to this group would be to say, okay, so, we're posing, that land protection has this role to play. How does it sort of get accounted for? And is it some kind of bonus point, right? It's not going to be, we're not going to try to shoehorn it into, the kind of strict accounting, I think, just doesn't make sense for this tool. But are there some kind of bonus points that get done for land protection programs that do prioritize, high carbon areas for protection, that start to bring these data sets in? So that I would love to hear your thoughts, honestly. All this amazing policy group that is here, on how to integrate that more fully. And the other thing I just wanted to say in terms of the organizations we grant to, while we don't grant directly to states, they are huge partners, right? So, in most of our programs, a large amount of the actual land is getting permanently protected and held by the state. And their funding is going into these projects too. So they're partners right alongside us. And that's why we care very much also about aligning our goals with them. So even though we're not granting to the states, they're very relevant in all this.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And Jed did mention there, and he's posting the link to it as well. So great, some analysis on better integrating climate criteria across federal programs, and obviously this is something that's the type of thing that you're aligning with, and how do we get you all to be able to contribute in the policy conversations to be able to explicitly say how the funding can be helpful to align with your goals and the way that you're shaping your programming now. So that kind of feeds into one of the next questions here. In your programs, you're speaking a lot currently about protecting high carbon areas. But can you unpack that a little bit more for us? So one of the questions here is, do you have a preference for mature forests that are currently storing lots of carbon, or younger forests that have low carbon storage but potential to carry high carbon, or to have or I guess this question is saying high carbon capture, so that's speaking more about sequestration rates. But I also had a similar question here about targeting areas that might be degraded or in need of some sort of intervention, but could potentially store carbon in the future. So can you just elaborate on that a little more? I mean, I know you showed some images of carbon now and what that would look like in the future, but in those different scenarios, how are you thinking about carbon in different places?
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Sure, I can go first, but I'll be able just to say all of the above. I mean, we have projects that are both. If they're low carbon now, if they're places that have been degraded, we want to know that there's really a good restoration plan. We are funding one project that is a really strong restoration project. It's floodplain restoration. It's actually a Nature Conservancy project in northern New Hampshire, and it's a place that they have been investing in over a long time frame. So we have confidence that it's going to happen, and it's really going to have high potential. So we want to know that's really going to happen and what it's going to really take in the near term. So, but they both need to happen. I mean, those really high carbon forests need to be protected now. So it's really both. But Abby, more to add there?
I think that the one concept I would share and add, which we sort of emphasize in that paper, one of the many links that were shared, kind of laying out the policy kind of, or the concepts behind what we just shared, which is irreplaceable carbon. So there's, that we really do not want to lose. There are high carbon forests to development, especially. And so making sure that those are under protection does make sense. It's a good use of this tool specifically, the land protection tool, to protect those high carbon forests. So I think that there's some preference for that. And then, management is probably the more relevant tool. Markets are very effective at incentivizing that increased sequestration in a lot of places. So when I think about the tool and what it's really good for, I do think there's a role for those high carbon forests, making sure those stay protected. And for me, there's still significant debate about, which ones are sequestering more carbon along the way too. So that's another one we could all discuss.
Yeah, definitely. So we are on our hour here, and at risk of going over for just a moment, I thought maybe I'd ask you just kind of one final, higher level question. You're talking about carbon here and protection. How do you think this is going to continue to shape your work going forward? Do you think this is going to change some of your funding models, continue to refine your prioritizations, or have knowledge gaps that need to be overcome in terms of communicating with landowners? Any thoughts of, how this might continue to evolve in OSI?
I see you did not unmute, Abby, so I'll say, I don't really have a good answer to that, Lauren. I'll say one thing that I do know we're really committed to learning more about is that integration between equity and justice and this climate work. We don't know where that's going to take us, and we are very open to seeing where that leads, especially around this learning and implementation and integration of traditional ecological knowledge. So I think that's the place where I see a lot of promise and unknown.
Great. Thanks. Any other thoughts, Abby, or did she get there?
No, I think that's right on. And I think also just, one of the pieces of wisdom that we're certainly hearing is let's make sure the solutions to climate change don't cause more problems, right? With lithium batteries, I mean, plenty of things to, so our forests are this wonderful solution. I don't think I have to tell that to anybody on this call, but to make sure we're capturing those multiple benefits and solving more problems than we're causing as we tackle this challenge ahead of us. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, this was, I strongly agree with all of that. So thanks so much for, again, taking the time to share all of your hard work with us. Clearly, OSI has been really embracing a lot of these ideas and been really a leader in figuring out how to grapple with a lot of data and information and use it to inform decision making. So it's really exciting to see the presentation that you laid out for us today. Just a quick reminder to everyone, the session is being recorded. We'll post the recording afterwards. And we will also post some links to these resources that were shared here as well. So those will be available and kind of easily cataloged at a later point if anyone wants to try to find those again. And so with that, since we're a few minutes over, we can kind of quickly wrap up. We have another session in a month and we dropped a link earlier to register for that. But Abby and Jennifer, again, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate all the hard work that you're doing and sharing it with us today.
Thank you so much to you, Lauren, and to Daphne too. Just really appreciate this opportunity.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great afternoon.